So the title up there says, "A new way, but efforts to create a remote cross-platform ID for Dyalog have been made for ages." For instance, this is a slide from a 2006 presentation. It suggests one possible way of running Dyalog on X by preserving the core of the Windows ID and using Wine and Mono as compatibility layers. It was natural to try to preserve as much as possible from the original Windows ID, given its level of sophistication as compared to the Linux/AIX terminal UI with its modest set of features and exotic key bindings, to say the least. And as compared to the Mac version, which didn't exist, and the idea emerged of an ID that is separate from the interpreter and can talk to it over the network, from any OS to any other, a remote ID, hence the fancy acronym RIDE. And a communication protocol was designed that uses XML and base64 to send commands around to synchronize the display with the content of editors' sessions and traces. JD implemented that idea in 2010 and presented a working prototype, if you remember. It had debugging auto-completion, syntax highlighting, like any decent IDE does, but it had one essential flaw. It was relying on doomed technology. After Microsoft abandoned Silverlight and Moonlight, RIDE had to be rewritten. So WPF.NET and C# were picked as the way forward. WPF, of course, works on any platform as long as that platform is Windows, so something extra needed to be done for the others. The plan was to separate the supposedly thin UI layer that depends on WPF from the more low-level code and substitute it with a GTK UI on Linux and ship it together with Mono. This was going on about the time when Dyalog hired me, or should I say domesticated me, and it could have worked. But as a matter of fact, it did work. Working GTK prototypes were indeed built, one by myself after a crash course in C#, but never saw the light of day. It happened that way. By the time we gathered in Eastbourne last year, WPF RIDE was released. That's the WPF version, Windows only. A few weeks prior to that, due to an upcoming change in the team, and possibly thanks to my relentless ranting about our heavy Microsoft bias, Morton decided to give this web thing a go and asked me to rewrite RIDE in JavaScript. As JavaScript works everywhere, and I'm more or less familiar with it. In those few weeks before the user meeting, I managed to put together a working session and a tracer, and an editor, obviously. That was sufficient for a quick demo and attracted some interest. So the project went full steam ahead after that, and with all of my time devoted to it. Support for other rides was officially dropped, and although we kept the protocol and the ride-related code in the interpreter, the front end had to be entirely rewritten, once again from start, as this Sisyphus image aptly suggests. The difference was that I think the ball was already past the peak then. We had something that worked on Linux, Windows, and OS X. We had it now in our hands, a single code base, using technology that no single company can just kill. That was what happened 1 year ago. Then it grew. It started as a simple single-page web app. Then we decided it would be better to disguise it as a desktop application using a technology called Node WebKit, which basically combines Node.js with a Chromium rendering engine, and lets us do that. We introduced floating windows, which, by the way, is a terrible pain in web development. We added UI for connecting to, accepting connections from, and launching interpreters. We supported such insanely great ideas like having the menu outside the window. Recently, Jason and JD wrapped it all in installers for the various platforms. And I must say it was already bloated from the beginning. I admit that it's bloated, due to the reliance on various pieces of technology that spent more CPU and time in order to save human time and effort. It's sad all software is like that, but you know, real programmers must ship. And bloat is inevitable when you're kind of in a hurry. At least it's not orders of magnitude more than what your typical browser tab consumes. Again, ride is Chromium plus Node.js plus the code I've written. So I guess it's understandable. On the other hand, having the same code run everywhere is absolutely priceless. So it wasn't long before in March this year, our propaganda department tweeted this and announced the availability of Ride on OS X. Exciting times. And of course now it can work on Windows, as it will be officially announced in sometime after the user meeting. Linux goes without saying, as you probably have guessed, I'm a Linux bigot. One question of particular interest, enough about the history, let's talk about actual problems it solves. One question of particular interest to APL is how to deal with its unusual character set. Of course, many of you have experienced this, and you know today's problems are not nearly as bad as they used to be in the early days. Now we have Unicode, and we have this adorable, awfully pleasant-looking, I think, font created by Adrian Smith. I really like that font. Characters that should be distinguishable are, and those that needn't aren't. I use it everywhere I can. Ride comes bundled with APL 385. You don't need to install anything, unless, of course, you want to use it in other applications. So I think we can consider the font question sorted. How about typing those characters? There have been a number of historical layouts. For example, here is one that goes back to half a century ago and is the basis of what we still use today. Unfortunately, it's hard to change what has already fossilized in hardware. But if we're not comfortable with it, we can use software to customize, the layout and not look down while we're typing. There have been a number of suggestions about how to rearrange the keys. For instance, here's Adrian again with one such attempt. In practice, it seems these don't catch on because almost everyone seems to accept the defaults in Dyalog as recommendations and stick to what's been pre-configured. All right, let's take a look at how some of these software solutions for customizing layouts work. On Windows, we've got the IME. You install Dyalog IME for whatever your national language is, and when you press Control plus some key, you get the corresponding squiggle. The problem with this is obvious. If your control key is taken over by APL, you can't use it for anything else. The situation is slightly better with XKB on Linux. APL characters pretend to be a national layout. Instead of control, you can hold down a configurable so-called latching key, which is usually the Windows key. A problem only arises if you have more than one layout for everyday communication, like myself, for instance. I need both Cyrillic and Latin. So these three. Since the three layouts are arranged in cyclical order, when I'm at Latin, holding down the latching key takes me temporarily to APL, but when I'm at Cyrillic, it takes me temporarily to Latin, which doesn't make an awful lot of sense. But it's not a huge pain, to be honest. By the way, I've been using one of those ergonomic keyboards happily for a few months now. So, given these keyboarding issues, I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice, without installing anything separate, to be able to map Control plus anything to anything, however you like, with minimum effort, just in the IDE itself. Ideally not with Control, though, because it's too loaded with expectations. Control-C for copy, Control-A for select all. So I came up with this idea to use an introducer. That's a prefix key as opposed to a modifier key. And backquote is a good candidate for that because it's not used in APL. And on most keyboards, it's in a... Well, you said it's a K thing, but it's in APL it's not used. It's used in K. It's configurable, yes. Well, it's also in a convenient location, so I think it's a good candidate on most keyboards. It turns out this works quite well, because you can still press the two keys like you normally do with Control plus something. This is what you do normally. And if you do the same with backquote, as long as you don't hold the introducer key for too long to avoid a repeat, and you don't press the other key multiple times, it's exactly the same as Control plus key. So we sneakily tested this idea in try-APL, and then I implemented it in RIDE. It's important to note that here it's a mapping from characters to characters. No keys are mapped, only characters. So this works one layer of abstraction above IME or XKB, and those would still work. So to have this pretty picture look roughly like what you have physically on your keyboard, you should select your locale in the drop-down over there. We support only a few now. We'll be adding more in due course. Please bug us if yours is missing. And here's an example just to make it more clear. This is what you need to press to get the characters in blue and red. Backquote followed by the letter E produces a membership symbol. Backquote followed by shiftless E produces epsilon underbar. Backquote, of course, being configurable. To help learners of APL remember the mappings, they are shown in the tooltips in the language bar and in the auto-completion menu after you type the prefix key. To help them even more, typing the prefix key twice followed by the name of a squiggle and then enter inserts that squiggle. And of course there's an auto-completion menu. It shows both ways to type it. As I said, none of these interfere with IME or XKB. In fact, RIDE enables the IME by default on Windows. That is an option, and I would recommend disabling it. Moving on to commands. By commands, I mean those 2 or 3 character codes for IDE actions such as TC for trace or LN for toggle line numbers. Their configuration in the old IDE looks like that. RIDE builds up on this tradition by supporting some of the old command codes and introducing new ones. In the preferences, you can add multiple shortcuts. This is in RIDE. In preferences, you can add multiple shortcuts for a command. Each button on the right resets the corresponding line to its defaults. Duplicates are validated for, and you can search, obviously. Just to give you a taste, here are some of the commands. Show preferences obviously brings up the preferences dialog. Align comments moves all comment symbols within the selection to the column of the rightmost comment symbol. Toggle fold is my preferred term for what used to be called toggle outline. Expand selection selects the token under the cursor, and if you press it again, it selects the whole line. If you press it once more, it selects the whole editor. I wish I had done it. I wish I had more time to do it in a more syntax-aware way, like if you're within a pair of parens or braces, it would know about them and expand the selection gradually. I think that would be useful. Some of the old commands have been assigned Unicode code points in the upper part of the so-called private use area in Unicode. RIDE can understand some of those, but it does not encourage their use or define new ones. Colors. Syntax highlighting is implemented in RIDE independently from the interpreter, so minor inconsistencies are to be expected. On the other hand, performance is much better this way. There is no communication with the interpreter, just to color something. By the way, I think syntax highlighting is beautifully engineered in CodeMirror, which is the editor component I use in RIDE. To support a programming language, the developer only writes a tokenizer in the form of a function that accepts a stream of characters and consumes a token from it. It can also accept and mutate a state object. And as you scroll in the editor, CodeMirror uses that function to parse only until the end of the current viewport. If you make a change somewhere, it reparses from there. It also copies and caches the state occasionally, so reparsing is very efficient and it doesn't freeze. I implemented a tokenizer for APL, including most of the hideous trap-fun syntax, but I omitted a few nasty edge cases, I must admit, such as and if, after, until. In RIDE's preferences, I added the ability to customize the colors. There are 4 built-in color schemes which I named after famous artists, because why not? Those are immutable, but you can clone them and customize the clone. This is how it works. When you click in the sample on the left on a certain syntactic element, the corresponding group gets selected in that drop-down over there at the top, and you can use the controls below it to change the foreground, background transparency. You can use bold, italic, underline, just like in regular HTML. This is what the built-in color schemes look like, and the corresponding artists, and some of their famous masterpieces. The last thing I'd like to mention, before I do a quick demo, is this thing, this nifty little feature called rainbow braces. Dfunds at different levels of nesting can have distinct colors for their braces. So it looks like this. And the corresponding alphas, omegas, dels, and columns are colored in the same color. So just by looking at an alpha, for instance this one in the middle there, it's easy to see which pair of braces it refers to. Alright, so let's try to show you some other tricks, the quickest of demos. Can you see that? No. Oh. I'll have to look back there. So suppose you're writing a function and you're writing an if. Pressed something I shouldn't have. Suppose you're writing a function and you write an if statement, and at this point you press enter. What happens is RIDE knows about the nesting and the syntactic structure of your function, and when you press enter, it completes with end if by default. It also adds indent. If you do it again, it doesn't do that because it knows there's an end if. And this is customizable. You can also choose. You can choose whether to do that. You can choose whether to close with just end, or end if and something. It also works for dfunds. So I'm typing. Now up there you should be able to see what I'm pressing. I typed just the opening curly, and it completed it with the closing curly brace. That's an option as well. I pressed enter, and it did this. But when you go down here to the session, where am I? Let's see my mouse. And I try to do this again. This will not be available in the this will not be available in the next version, right? Okay. So how are we doing for time? I guess I'll open up for questions now, because I expect there to be some. So if there are any questions, if you could just step up to the microphone. Could I show auto completion? Like, for instance, what quad? Oops, not quad. Should I do that? Back quote L. Oh, I want to show double back quote. You press back quote twice, and you can select from this list. For instance, type times, and press enter, and you get the time symbol. What is lacking? I think many people would miss the Workspace Explorer and the Class Explorer. Quite a lot is there indeed, but let me give you an example about what's missing. The devil is in the details, obviously. For some reason, people like to use the debugger. People make bugs, I don't know why. If you hover over a name in the old IDE, you get the value of the the name you're hovering. You don't have this in RIDE yet. We will add it soon. But there are many tiny details like that. It takes time to have them.
Okay, so this is not a question. I have been using this RIDE myself to develop my server applications on the Mac and also on Windows to test it, and it's perfectly usable. You can use it now. I think also some of the features that you've seen here are likely to make their way back into the Windows IDE. I'd like to see the double quote to the back quote stuff and other features here make their way back.
Hi. I use user commands a lot, and I've implemented them into my standard editor session, what I see. Will I be able to do that with RIDE?
Are you talking about function keys?
Well, I use function keys. I add my own menus to implement commands, and I run user commands, the square bracket commands, from the session. I build them into the session.
User commands should work because they're a feature of the interpreter. They have nothing to do with the IDE.
But can I insert into the IDE the structure, the menus, the drop downs? Can I?
No, you can't do that. It's completely different. It's a new RIDE. But if there's need to. Right. All right. We are running out of time, so thank you.